A while ago, I did a video reviewing the Sub Gen 3 and compared it with the Sub Gen 2. There was a big difference that no one spoke about, which is the driver design. The driver has been completely redesigned by Sonos and they never said a thing about it. No marketing, no fanfare, and not even a single line of text anywhere on the website or spec sheet. Today, we talk about the driver design that Sonos doesn't want to talk about. Let's find out if it makes a difference at all. In the earlier video comparing the Sub Gen 3 with the Sub Gen 2, I've illustrated the differences and the similarities, and I've also included a recorded sound demo of the two for comparison. If you want to view that video, I'm linking it right above here. Since then, I've had the opportunity to play around with the Sub Gen 3 a lot more and conducted more tests. Today, we go into an in-depth study on the most significant change, the driver design. My usual practice is to give you the summary of my video up front. The driver is different, yes. The rubber surround is thinner and it should affect the performance, but in practice, there is very little that is taken away. And the result is still a very capable subwoofer. My personal conclusion to this whole in-depth deep dive into the driver design is that there is no appreciable difference for most people. If you want hard-hitting bass in your Sonos setup, go for the Sub Gen 2 if you want to save a bit of money, the Sub Gen 3 if you want to future-proof your investment a bit longer. There's a slight difference in the sound profile, but I won't necessarily call one better and the other one worse. The Sub Gen 3 hits harder, but seems to be a little bit less even around the whole room. The Sub Gen 2 doesn't hit as hard, but the lower bass frequencies seems to be a little bit more even around the whole room. Another notable point is that the Sub Gen 2, without the differences in crossover settings at all, it seems to be easier to localize around the room, as in it does draw attention to itself more readily. Seriously, either way, I find no reason for anyone to regret their choices. If you have the Sub Gen 2 already, I'll say that there is actually very little reason for you to move. If any of my one reason gives you an excuse to upgrade, you know you have already decided to upgrade, so go for it. The ultimate test is in the listening. And from what I'm hearing, you're effectively still getting the same great subwoofer performance from either the Gen 2 or the Gen 3. So, if you have some time to finish up this video, do stay on and let me go through with you what I've done to derive at this conclusion. And along the way, I will also explain all the design differences of the cone and the impact it has on the Sub Gen 3's performance. If you love such in-depth reviews, do consider subscribing to this channel. I would say that no one else is going so deep into Sonos products on YouTube. You have found the right channel, stick with me and join the community here. If you take a closer look at the Sub Gen 3, you'll notice that the cone is shaped more aggressively and it has a dish shape that is a lot more concave. I'm not saying that this is an upgrade or a downgrade, but it is definitely different. Technically, the more deeply shaped it is, the more surface area it has, and it should technically allow it to move more air for more bass impact. And yes, if you look inside, the Sub Gen 3 actually has a redesigned rubber surround too. It looks like it is now a lot thinner and not as beefy as the one in Sub Gen 2. The Sub Gen 2 had a ribbed design for the rubber surround and it looks a lot thicker surrounding the cone. Technically, this allows for greater movement of the cone and it will allow for the sub to work harder and for much longer. In the long run, the longevity of a subwoofer comes down to the reliability of the amp and the rubber surround of the driver. A thinner surround doesn't bode well in that aspect, but only time will tell. With a change in the cone design and the rubber surround, I was quite curious if that impacted the cone size. Sonos never talked about the size of the cone and they just deliver on the promise of great bass, never mind the specification. So, is the surface area of the cone really bigger or smaller? For this, I'm deploying my flexible ruler which I have printed. Let's see. So to measure the cone surface area, it was not quite possible to use a stiff ruler and measure it because it just won't fit and it's not going to be very accurate. So what I did was to actually print out a ruler. And with this printed ruler, which I have calibrated using an actual ruler, it actually states that, well, it's accurate, but it was a little bit flimsy. So I laminated it. I actually laminated it, and I created a flexible ruler, and it goes in. Now I'm going to try to measure this. I'm going to use the centimeter scale. So 2 measurements. First measurement, I will take the height and the width of the cone area. And there you go. Follow the curve, and it comes in at 14.4 centimeters. Flexible ruler, how nice. And this is about 7.7 centimeters. The next measurement we're going to take will include the surrounds, right? All the way from here up to here. All right? It does not include the ridged rubber surround, which is all the way into the enclosure, just the edge of the surround to the other edge of the surround. So first, again, the height. And it goes to 16 centimeters. Let's do it from the other side. It goes to a little bit generous, 9.1 centimeters. Okay, so this is the Sub Gen 3. Just the cone. The cone itself is deeper dished, so I'm expecting it to cover a little bit more area at the peak. And we have 14.4 centimeters. Oh, exactly the same. And across, okay, let's do this. It comes in at 7.8. Okay, and now including the rubber surround, which I'm actually suspecting it to be a lot deeper, a lot longer and wider, because the surround is thinner now. There's less of a gap. There isn't a ridged gap here. So the whole area, the whole moving surface area should be a lot deeper. Wow, 18 centimeters. That's a good 2 centimeters bigger moving area than the Sub Gen 2. And then across. Oh God, this is huge. It's about 12 centimeters. What? Gosh, that's almost 3 centimeters wider across. Okay, so there you go. We have measured the cone dimensions. This Sub Gen 3 has a much larger cone size. The whole surface area, the whole movable surface area is a lot bigger than the Sub Gen 2. So the actual cone size on both the Gen 2 and the Gen 3 is similar, but due to the redesign of the rubber surround on the Gen 3, it actually has a larger movable surface area. And that, in theory, means that the driver can move more air, sound deeper and louder, all else being equal. But besides the cone size, the other driver specification that affects the performance of the subwoofer is the driver stroke, what some might call the treble. So after talking about how the cone design and rubber surround can possibly affect that, it is time to measure the cone treble. This is not easy to measure. You can't access the opposing cones easily, but I've come up with a way around it. I need to get a ruler inside, but it has to be a short one so that it doesn't interfere with the cone itself. I also need to make sure that it doesn't impede the airflow. The Sonos Sub is actually a ported design, and air actually needs to flow through this acoustic slot here. So it has to be unobstructed. I've printed, again, a ruler, and the ruler can be cut down in size, and I'm mounting it within the slot here, taped down diagonally across opposite ends. At the first trial, I realized that the paper wasn't going to cut it because there was so much air movement. I had to rethink it. The paper was fluttering all over the place. I then printed on 100 GSM paper and laminated with 200 GSM laminating pouches. The result was a stiff card, and it resisted the air movement much better. All I have to do is to put in a toothpick, stick it on the cone with blue tack. The recording will have to be done with a lot of light. and a very fast lens, high frame rate, fast shutter speed, so that it captures the entire range of motion of the cone, and we can see exactly how far it travels. First, we will look at the Sub Gen 2 cone travel. The central mounting position was at about 6.9 cm. It got pulled back all the way to 6.4 centimeters and pushed out to a max of 7.9 centimeters. This is a total throw of 1.5 cm. For a driver of this size, this amount of throw is crazy. And there are two of these drivers inside this one sub. For the Sub Gen 3, you can see that the toothpick had to be mounted a lot further in. It's because the cone shape is deeper. The central mounting position was 6.4 centimeters. It got pulled back into 5.8 and then pushed out to 7.3 centimeters. That is for a total throw of 1.5 centimeters. So this is similar to the Gen 2, but we already know that the movable surface area of the cone on the Sub Gen 3 is bigger due to the redesign of the rubber surround. So does this mean that the Sub Gen 3 is capable of going deeper and louder? Well, it's not so straightforward. There is still the magnet that is being used by the drivers. A more powerful magnet will make it louder and go deeper. But that also requires a larger and more powerful amplifier. But there's one problem. A larger and stronger magnet means it should be heavier. A more powerful amp will also increase the weight. But the Sub Gen 3 is listed at 16 kg on the Sonos website. And that's the weight that is listed for the Sonos Sub Gen 2. Which means to say, the two subs are supposed to be of the exact same weight. So that means that the magnet and the amplifier both remains unchanged, right? But no, they're not. Sonos did not tell us that they weigh different. In fact, worse than not telling us, Sonos told us they weigh the same. The Sub Gen 3 is listed at 16 kg still. And I'm not talking about tens of grams of difference. I'm talking about a full 2 kilograms of difference. And in pounds, that's 4.5 pounds difference in weight. And when you have both the Gen 2 and the Gen 3 holding them one in each arm, you will actually feel that they significantly differs in weight. There are three components that makes up the bulk of a subwoofer: the enclosure itself, the amplifier with the power supply, and the woofer driver itself. A heavy enclosure means that there's less resonance and vibration. A heavier amp and power supply means that it's capable of putting out more power. A heavier cone and magnet means that it has bigger and stronger magnets that could move the cone in a more authoritative manner. But with the Sub Gen 3 losing significant weight, I don't know if this is going to help it perform any better. But before we go into the performance differences, we'll just leave it as that. The Sub Gen 3 is pounds lighter than the Sub Gen 2, and no one likes a lighter subwoofer. And my suspicion is that the weight loss is from the driver redesign itself, and likely to be a change in the magnet use. The enclosure looks largely the same, and Class D amplifiers today won't differ too much in weight. Definitely not a 4.5 pounds difference. But the way I do things analyzing speakers, I go all the way. So I look at the amps too. I can't quite measure the amps in any accurate way without opening up the sub and voiding warranty. So I'll just measure the power draw of these subs. I've done a power draw test for the Sub Gen 2 before, and it was topping out at 245 watts at full load. The video for the power draw test of the Sub Gen 2 is linked here. It is not a very scientific method, but Sonos doesn't reveal the specifications, so I have to devise my own way to measure it. Today, given that the Sub Gen 3 is already lighter and that the cones are shaped differently with a different design for its rubber surrounds, does the power draw change? Let's find out. I'll be pairing the Sub Gen 3 with the Sonos amp, and I'll be disconnecting my ceiling speakers from the Sonos amp. The last time I tried to test the power draw of the Sonos amp with the ceiling speakers, I almost burned the house down. So this will be a pure test of the Sonos Sub Gen 3 power output without the ceiling speakers limiting the volume that I can set the sub to. I have set the sub gain to plus 15 and the volume of the system maxed out, bass EQ set to plus 10 max, and loudness is turned on. It should, in theory, stress the sub out to the max. I ran through the test tones from 20 Hz onwards, trying to hit as high as possible without irritating my next door neighbors. I am also redoing the test for the Sub Gen 2 to ensure that the test conditions are as similar as possible, with the exact same M, exact same EQ settings for both the subs today. Let's get to it. The Sub Gen 2 is linked to a power monitor, which is out of sight. I'm recording using another camera. The white plug belongs to the Sub Gen 2, which is in white. The black plug belongs to the Sub Gen 3, which is in black. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do the testing and a max draw of 299.7 watts. Okay, let's see what the max wattage draw is. This is the highest draw at 275 watts as compared to almost 300 watts on the Sub Gen 3. So this sounds big, yeah? The Gen 3 is drawing 299 watts at its peak, and the Sub Gen 2 is drawing 275 watts at the peak. Power draw from the wall is not the same as the power output of the M-Sub combination. Manufacturers usually quote peak output levels, and that is usually a lot higher than the actual power that is drawn from the wall. I won't speculate on that, and such marketing is another topic for another day. Suffice to say that this is a lot of power for a subwoofer of these dimensions. And if you look at some of the competitor soundbars with subwoofer combinations, they're going to come in at well below 100 watts for the subwoofer. So we've covered the cone size, we've covered the travel stroke, the weight of the unit, as well as the power draw of the M. And I have concluded that the movable cone area is bigger for the Sub Gen 3. The travel for both units are about the same. The weight of the Gen 3 is lighter, but the M draws more power. What does all this result in? The final test today is the frequency response of both the subs. Let's see how all these differences change the frequency response of these two units. As I've been testing the frequency response curves for the Sonos Arc, this is a timely test for a revised frequency test for the Sub Gen 3, but this time connected to the Sonos amp. The last test I did, I compared the response with the Sub Gen 3 connected to the Arc and the Gen 2 connected to the Sonos amp. But this introduced a variable of the crossover. The crossover for the Arc is different from the crossover that we can set on the Sonos amp. Since then, I figured out that the crossover for the Arc is about 92 Hz. The amp, on the other hand, allows for a much more precise crossover setting, which is configurable. So today, I will put both the subs through the test again, this time with both of them running off a Sonos amp. This should give a conclusive frequency response curve for both the subs, and finally, we can visualize if all these changes come together to better the performance of the Sub Gen 3. Today's measurements are taken with the sub positioned in the middle of the room so as to avoid any sound waves bouncing off the walls and affecting the measurement. I've also positioned the mic very close to the sub so that we won't be measuring any of the room effects, just the first wave that is coming out from the sub itself. Now the red curve you see is that of the Sub Gen 3. The green curve is the frequency response for the Sub Gen 2. As I've noted in an earlier video, the Sub Gen 3 hits lower, and this is evidenced by the bump at the lower frequency of about 28 Hz. While the Sub Gen 2 doesn't get as loud as the Gen 3 at lower frequencies of the subsonic range, it does remain flatter and maintains volume better right up to about 60 Hz. The Sub Gen 2 then suffers from a dip at about 76 Hz, while the Gen 3 flattens out a bit at that range. Now, one thing to note is that the Sub Gen 3 filters out the frequencies past the crossover point very smoothly, while the Gen 2 has a hike at 130 Hz. This explains the fact that the Sub Gen 2 actually does sound easier to localize. Frequencies above 120 Hz carry a lot of audible energy and already starts to lend a lot of direction to the sound. So if you go through the sound samples that I'm posting later, you will realize that the bass notes for the Sub Gen 2 can be localized to the side where the sub is placed. After all the measurement and the testing, I fear that we might have overdone it. Sure, there are differences between the two generations of the subs. Sure, Sonos didn't highlight these to us. But then again, Apple never told us about the many specification changes in the internals of their products. They just make sure it works and that it works well. So maybe that is all that matters. All the work I've been doing is for the journalistic value and to share with you guys out there in case there's anyone who wants to know. If you're keen in such videos, subscribe and I'll see you around. Whatever changes that has been made, it is all good, and my advice is to add a sub. Gen 2 or Gen 3, it really doesn't matter. Add a sub and give your music and movies that extra layer of sound performance. You will not regret adding a sub to your Sonos ecosystem. Finally, I'll play a few short music clips of the Sonos Arc paired with the Sub Gen 2 and the Sub Gen 3, alternating between the two in between tracks. You can decide for yourself if you prefer the sound of one better than the other. Have a great day, and I'll see you around in my next video.